Hi everyone, my name is Akshay Bianca. I'm a second year history and modern languages student at Pembroke College, Cambridge. And today I'm joining all of you with the Pembroke College Admissions Tutor, who is also my Director of Studies, Caroline Burt. So one thing I think which is quite clear about the Oxbridge application process is the amount of kind of steps and different elements that come with it. For example, the admissions test, the personal statement, the interviews. And when you're looking at all of that, what is it that you're looking for with your students that have applied to you? Like what things stand out to you for the applicants that you give offers to in the end?
Okay, so I suppose if you were going to boil it down to two essential areas in the first instance, if you're talking really broadly, the first is that you've got in front of you somebody who's applying for a course that they're really interested in. It's not simply a means to an end. It is something that they know that they're going to really enjoy, or they feel that they're going to really enjoy. They've done enough kind of spade work learning about what the content of the course is to think, yeah, this is a good fit with my interests. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the person in front of you is going to have an aptitude for that course, has the right skill set to make the very best of the interest that they obviously have. So those are the kind of key things that you're looking for as you go through an application that you want to sort of see in the information that's coming through to you.
And with people being kind of suitable for the degree they've chosen, I think it can be quite difficult sometimes, say if you're studying maths, physics and chemistry and you're picking between engineering or natural sciences with physics, or maybe HSPS and history. What advice could you maybe give to the year 12 with us today on how to really understand what degree is right for them?
That's a really good question. It's not always straightforward, and actually there are lots of connections, particularly if you think about the subjects that you just talked about. There are lots of connections between them. In fact, I've got a colleague who did his undergraduate degree in maths. He did his PhD in the physics department because the sort of maths he was interested was very much closer to physics, and he now lectures in the engineering department on the very, very mathematical side of engineering. So actually there are lots and lots of overlaps, but obviously when you're thinking about applying for a degree, you need to plump for one, make a choice. So what I would do is basically look at university course guides, not just Cambridge, but all universities that you think you might be interested in. Look at what the content of the course is and think about how you react to that instinctively. You know, there are always things that we all look at and we say, oh, I find that very interesting, or wow, that's right up my street. So think about what your instinctive reaction is, but also think about when you're at school, what is it particularly that you enjoy about your maths or your physics or your chemistry? You know, try and draw out what it is that you like most about it, and that will often tell you a great deal. So for example, when I was applying to university, I had a big debate between history and English literature, and I didn't do it at the time. I just kind of plumped for one instinctively, and it turned out to be the right one for me. But I think if I were advising somebody, what I'd say is, well, think about what it is that you enjoy most, as I said earlier. And if I look back to history and English literature, one of the things I was always interested with English was the context around it. So the period that it was talking about. So I was interested in the novels and plays, etc., for their own, on their own terms, but I always wanted to know about that wider context. And in lots of ways that tells me quite a lot about myself. It doesn't tell me I'm necessarily a historian, but it starts to hint that there might be a little bit more historical side to me, if you like. So just kind of consider those things as you assess the subjects, and try and make a decision that fits with what you've reacted to most positively. And if you're really not sure, there are often ways of choosing more general courses that enable you not to specialise too much early on. So for example, one of the great things about the Cambridge Natural Sciences course is that it's broad. So you don't have to choose exactly which part of science you're interested in right at the outset. You can do that as you progress through the course. So look for those sorts of courses. Again, a general engineering course gives you those options, whereas if you go straight into one particular type of engineering, it's not so easy to kind of shuffle backwards and go into a different area later. So if you're not sure and you know your interest is quite general, then looking for those sorts of courses is going to be really helpful.
Great, that's so useful. I wish I'd known that really when I was thinking about applying.
So do I.
back a few years ago. I mean, luckily I picked history and modern languages, which does stay quite broad. I mean, for all of you watching, I am doing dissertations in hip hop music and 15th century wars and shields and swords and stuff. So it's all very broad and all very interesting. But now you have this student who's applied to you and you're thinking, oh, they're actually probably quite a good fit, but then you have all the other steps, the application process that have come with it. So when you're looking at their performance, for example, in admissions tests or their interviews or the work they've submitted, how do you actually assess that level of suitability for the course and kind of capacity to deal well with kind of the work that Cambridge is?
So the first thing I would say is there's not a kind of one size fits all. We don't sort of take each element like tests or interviews or exam results, predictions, those sorts of things and say, right, this one has this weighting, this one has this weighting, this one has that weighting. What you're trying to do is build up a picture of that student academically. So you're focused wholly on the academic side of them because you're assessing their aptitude for an interest in a particular course that they've applied for. So you're looking for that big picture. I often kind of liken it to a jigsaw. So if you do a jigsaw, jigsaws have lots of pieces, and some of the pieces, as you put them in, they tell you very little about the picture that's going to emerge. And other pieces, you put it in, you go, oh, I know what this is going to be. And then there are others where it kind of hints at something. And this is like that. So for the students who apply to us, different elements of their application can be like those different pieces of the jigsaw, and you don't always know which one's going to be which sort of piece. But the point is, in a way, that doesn't quite matter because you're putting it all together and looking at the picture that emerges at the end. And that's what we sometimes talk about this as holistic assessment. And that's what we mean by that. We look at it all together. By and large, obviously, when you're assessing students who are applying, you're assessing both their absolute ability and interest and how they look in those terms relative to the other candidates who've applied, because it's a competition, so there are more candidates apply than we have places available. So you're always making those comparative judgments as well. So you put it all together and you're looking for what picture is emerging. It's true to say that not everyone will perform brilliantly on every element of the admissions process. I think people who are applying tend to think that that will be the case, that everyone who applies is an absolute genius. And I thought this as well. And I thought, you know, I'll be the one who's kind of, you know, not great at this or whatever. The truth is that a tiny fraction of those who apply to us are brilliant on every measure. Like, that's a tiny, tiny fraction. Most people are good on some elements, sometimes really good on some elements, sometimes a little bit less good on other elements. And that's normal. That's the kind of, the picture that's in front of you of all students looks very much like that. And so a lot of the decisions we make are obviously quite fine judgments because you're comparing people who are really, really good, and that's the truth, but where there are slight differences academically between them, and you're trying to kind of deal with that and work out which person's going to be the strongest student as best you possibly can. It's true to say that the better you can do in terms of your exam predictions and on things like tests and interviews, etc., it stands to reason. The better you can do, the better your application's going to be. But as I say, you don't need to be brilliant on every single element of it.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, just like you mentioned at the end of that answer is the element of tests and stuff at school. And you mentioned it, like, do as well as you can. But when it comes to the very much Oxbridge specific side of the application, what's the best way to prepare, for example, for putting interesting elements to your personal statement or preparing for admissions tests?
Okay, and I'd probably throw interviews in with that one as well, if you're all right with that. So I think the personal statement, for those who aren't aware, and please forgive me for those who are, but when you apply to university in the UK, you apply to a limited number and you write one personal statement, and that goes to all of the universities that you apply to. So you don't tailor that for a specific university. But it's true to say that every admissions tutor in every university who's assessing those applications as they come in is looking for you to demonstrate your interest in the course that they're offering. And obviously you have to talk in quite general terms. because you can't talk about one specific course in one institution, but you can talk about the overall subject area. And what we're looking for is for you to draw out for us what it is you've done in your spare time that's related to that subject, and what you've got out of that. Now, for most subjects, that's going to be wider reading, but if you're a mathematician, for example, it's likely to be maths problems instead. And what you need to tell us about is what you've read, why you found it interesting, what it said, why it was better than this other thing you read, why you were particularly interested in this area. Or if it's something like pure maths problems, then telling us, well, why did I do this problem? How did I go about solving it? How might I have gone about it differently? Why did I find it interesting, etc. So exactly the same sorts of principles. And again, the same if you're applying for something like languages or English, where you're reading, say, novels, whether they're in a language other than English, or you're reading plays for English literature, whatever it may be. Again, why did I enjoy it? What does it tell me about the author, etc. What comes out of that is, what do you get out of this? It's personal, it's a personal statement. So we're interested in what you found interesting, and what you found interesting won't necessarily be the same as what another student finds interesting, but it's no less legitimate for that. In fact, it's just as legitimate. So tell us a bit about what you've read and what you've done and what you got out of it. So that's the personal statement, and that should form the vast bulk of it. When we move on to things like tests and interviews, it becomes very academically focused in lots of ways. So with the aptitude tests in Cambridge, there are, in some subjects, there are pre-interview assessments, and in other subjects, there are at-interview assessments. So the first thing to do is obviously check which category your course falls into. Whatever the case, there are then two sorts of assessment, broadly speaking, two sorts of assessments. Some that need subject knowledge, where actually you've got to revise before them and make sure you know your stuff. And others where they're much more aptitude based. You don't go in with any specific knowledge. You might be asked to compare and contrast a couple of passages or something. There you obviously need to practice that skill set. So go with both sets of types of test. Whether it needs particular knowledge or it's particularly aptitude based, you need to go and look at the past papers, do practice to time, because obviously time makes a big difference to how you answer, and you need to get used to that time that you have, and also time you don't have, and learn what you can do in the allotted slot for that assessment. So best to prepare by revising if it's relevant, doing practices to time, and making sure you understand the format of the assessment, because you can revise most effectively or prepare most effectively if you understand the format. Don't do loads and loads and loads of preparation, because the more you do doesn't make a huge difference to how you're likely to do. So you should certainly do some preparation and take it seriously and do some timed examples, as I said earlier. But if you do endless amounts of preparation, apart from anything else, you can get a bit stale. But also, it doesn't need it. They're designed not to need that sort of input, because you've got your other work to be doing for school, and that's more important in lots of ways in terms of your eventual outcomes at A level or IB or whatever it may be. Interview. So the best way to think about an interview is, I think, as a kind of interactive aptitude test. So it's not gonna, you're not going to go in there and you're not going to be kind of personality tested. You know, it's not that sort of experience. So an interactive aptitude test is a really good way of thinking about it and describing it, because it makes you realise that essentially what you're going to do is be talking to the lecturer or lecturers about your subject, and you're going to be asked questions that are obviously quite challenging, that you're not necessarily going to find easy to answer, but you're going to need to work through them. So again, subjects like engineering or physics, you need to go back and revise. And languages, you need to revise your vocab and your grammar. We'll often be a little bit less worried about your pronunciation, because you can easily learn that. You have a year abroad to do that anyway in a language, but vocab and grammar, that's important. So revise. If you're applying for something like history or English and you've sent some essays in, then make sure you read through them so that you can talk about them if they're asked about at interview. Go back over your personal statement, make sure you've read everything you talked about there, or maybe reread to refresh yourself on what you thought and what you said there, and be prepared to talk about those academic things. So don't worry if the interviewers don't really ask you much about yourself. Be reassured, it's not that we don't care about our students. We're very interested in our students as individuals, but in an interview, you're assessing that person's aptitude for the course. So you're very focused on the academic side of things. So if you think about what we're trying to get from each stage of the process, that's how you get the best sense of how to prepare. Oh, I should say one thing, it's not critical. If you are meeting an interviewer in person, you don't need to have a firm handshake, you don't need to make eye contact. We're not worried about any of those things. They're completely immaterial to the way we judge your application. So don't get stressed about appearing the right way, etc., whatever the right way might mean.
In fact, on that, could we maybe discuss what the interviews are actually like? So how long they are, maybe how many fellows or lecturers are in the room with you, and maybe what kind of preparation work you might get depending on the subjects you have?
Yeah, really good question. So the length of interviews varies a little bit from college to college, subject to subject. So for example, in one college, you might have a 20 to 30-minute interview with 2 interviewers. In another college, you might have a 40-minute interview with 2 interviewers, but you'll only have 1, whereas maybe at the other college, you'd have 2 shorter interviews. So it varies a little bit. And what you should do is make sure you check the college website that you're applying to and see what it says about the format of their interviews. Last year we had virtual interviews, so again the format changed a little bit because we had to think about doing interviews over Zoom or Whereby or various other sorts of platforms. I think they were the 2 that we used in the university. So have a look, it varies a little bit, but as I say, the essential function of the interview remains the same. You'll be the only candidate in the interview, so it's not like kind of beat the buzzer. You're not up against other candidates sitting there and whoever's fastest to the buzzer wins. You will be on your own in that interview. It's about assessing you as an individual. But there may be a couple of lecturers interviewing you. That's the most likely scenario actually, that you'll have 2 interviewers, and while one's asking questions, sometimes the other one's making notes, or they might both be asking you questions very interactively throughout. But it will become rapidly quite clear to you, and they'll explain things to you, etc. And if you're not clear about anything, you can always ask as well. So it's very important for you to know that you can sort of stop at any point and say, oh, I didn't really understand that question. Is there any way you could repeat it? Or I haven't done that at school, or whatever it may be. Sometimes the interviewer at that point, by the way, might say to you, well, don't worry, you haven't done it at school. I still think because of the things you have done, you can have a go at this question. Don't worry, we don't expect you to get all the way to the answer in one jump. In fact, most of the questions we ask, they're kind of staged. So you go through a number of stages as you work through them. So as I say, kind of preparing is about revising, knowing your stuff, being willing to talk about your subject, maybe practice talking to people in your family or friends just about your subject so you can get used to having those sorts of discussions, and build confidence. I often say to students that you should start, ironically, talk to your friends about something you're really into, that's maybe not work. I don't know, it could be the football, it could be particular music, whatever. And start thinking about stepping back from it and saying, well, why is my football team the best one in the Premier League? Or why didn't they win the FA Cup? Or why is the manager not, performing? Or why do I like this sort of music better than this sort of music? And if you start with stuff like that, it's quite low pressure because it's the stuff you do in your spare time, and it's not, you're not being examined on it, but you get used to sort of stepping back and thinking about things and build some confidence, so that then when you start applying that to something like a novel you read for English literature, or some element of physics that you're interested in, you start to understand what that means, and that in many ways academic work is not really very different from anything we talk about in life, that actually stepping back and being analytical and understanding why and thinking about why, some of the kind of most important things we can do, whatever it is. So
definitely. Great, thank you so much. I think that's a really nice note to end on, this kind of Cambridge Applications 101 tour with myself and the Pembroke Admissions Tutor. To everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning in. Best of luck with your applications, and I'm sure you'll all do brilliantly in the future. Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and thank you Akshar as well. It's been really good talking to you.